We have some exciting news to share with you about the sequel of Mel Gibson's.
The resurrection of the Christ being the sequel.
Yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ. It's like, so that's a title.
What if everything you know about Jesus is only half the story? Hidden in the mountains of Ethiopia are manuscripts lost to Western history, revealing a Christ unlike any you've seen, a cosmic warrior, battling powers beyond imagination. And now, Mel Gibson's next film, The Resurrection of the Christ, may bring this secret vision to life.
You got any updates on a potential resurrection film?
Yeah. I'm working on that. That, of course, is very difficult.
For nearly 2,000 years, history has kept it hidden. Tonight, we uncover the truth. Are you ready? Though lost Jewish texts. Before we can talk about what Ethiopia preserved, we need to understand what was lost, or rather what was sidelined. In the centuries before Jesus was born, Jewish literary culture was extraordinarily productive. Scribes, priests, and visionaries produced a vast body of writings that went far beyond the Torah and the prophets. These texts explored angels and demons, the architecture of heaven, the origins of evil, the coming judgment of the world, and the nature of a mysterious figure they called the Son of Man. Two of the most significant of these texts are the Book of Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah. The Book of Enoch, known more precisely as First Enoch, is a composite work.
First Enoch brings a vivid cosmology, the story of the Watchers, fallen angels, and their offspring.
Scholars generally date its various sections from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century BCE. That makes parts of it older than the Book of Daniel. It is a product of what historians call Second Temple Judaism, the period between the rebuilding of the Jerusalem Temple around 516 BCE and its destruction by Rome in 70 CE. This was the intellectual and spiritual world that produced Jesus, Paul, and the earliest Christian communities. Enoch is attributed to the biblical patriarch who, according to Genesis, walked with God and was taken up without dying. In the text, Enoch is given visions of the heavenly realm. He sees the throne of God. He witnesses the judgment of fallen angels called the Watchers, who descended to earth and corrupted humanity. He encounters a radiant figure called the Son of Man, who sits beside God and will execute judgment over all nations. Now pause on that for a moment. A Son of Man, seated at the right hand of God, coming in glory to judge the living and the dead. Sound familiar? When Jesus calls himself the Son of Man in the Gospels, he is not using a random phrase. He is drawing on a deep well of Jewish apocalyptic imagery, and that well includes Enoch. Now, the connection is not subtle. The Epistle of Jude, a canonical book of the New Testament accepted by every major Christian tradition, directly quotes 1 Enoch. Jude 1:14-15 attributes a prophecy to Enoch the seventh from Adam, and the quoted passage comes almost word for word from 1 Enoch 1:9.
There is First Enoch, which is the Ethiopic Enoch, the oldest and most significant, which was written between 300 BC and 100 BC.
This is not disputed by mainstream scholars. A canonical New Testament author quoted Enoch as authoritative. The Book of Revelation, meanwhile, is saturated with imagery that parallels Enoch. The throne room of God surrounded by heavenly creatures, the opening of sealed books, the judgment of the wicked, the lake of fire, the new heaven and new earth. While direct literary dependence is debated, the shared apocalyptic vocabulary is unmistakable. They are products of the same visionary tradition. The Ascension of Isaiah is a different kind of text, but equally powerful. Likely composed in the 1st or 2nd century CE, it describes the prophet Isaiah being taken on a journey through 7 heavens. In each heaven, he sees angels of increasing glory. When he reaches the 7th heaven, he witnesses a staggering scene. Christ, pre-existent and radiant, is commissioned by God to descend through all 7 heavens to earth. But he does not descend as a conquering king. He descends in disguise, dimming his glory at each level so that the angels of each heaven do not recognize him. He arrives on earth as a mortal. He suffers, he dies, and then he ascends back through the heavens, this time in full glory, and every knee bows. This is a deeply theological narrative. It is not science fiction. It is an early Christian community working out the meaning of the incarnation through the cosmological language available to them. And it offers a vision of Christ that is, by any measure, staggering in its scope. So what happened to these texts? The standard story points to the formation of the biblical canon. In 363 CE, the Council of Laodicea issued one of the earliest known lists restricting which books could be read in churches. But here is what is important to understand. Canon formation was not a single dramatic event.
This is the largest biblical canon in Christianity. It contains the 66 books of the Old and the New Testament.
There was no moment where a group of bishops sat around a table and voted books in or out like a legislative session. It was a slow, organic, and often contested process that played out differently in different regions over several centuries. Some texts were excluded because their authorship was questioned. Some because their theology was seen as incompatible with emerging orthodoxy. Some simply fell out of use. The word apocryphal, often misunderstood as meaning false or heretical, originally meant something closer to hidden or set aside. Many apocryphal texts were not rejected as lies. They were simply not included in the final canonical list. The reasons were varied, complex, and sometimes political. But in Ethiopia, these books never left. Ethiopia preserved scripture. To understand why Ethiopia preserved what others lost, you have to understand Ethiopia itself. Christianity did not arrive in Ethiopia as a colonial import. It was not brought by European missionaries centuries after the faith was established. It arrived early, remarkably early. According to both Ethiopian tradition and corroborating historical sources, Christianity became the official religion of the Aksumite Empire in the 4th century CE under King Ezana. Aksum, located in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, was one of the great powers of the ancient world. It traded with Rome, Persia, and India. Its obelisks still stand today, monuments to a civilization that rivaled its contemporaries in sophistication. The conversion of Ezana is generally dated to around 330 CE. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same period as Constantine's embrace of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Ethiopia did not receive the faith secondhand. It adopted it at the same historical moment as Rome. But here is the crucial difference. Ethiopia's geographic isolation, surrounded by mountains, deserts, and eventually by the expansion of Islam across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, meant that its Christian tradition developed along its own trajectory. It was not shaped by the same councils, at the same political pressures, the same theological debates that defined Western and Byzantine Christianity. When the rest of the Christian world was narrowing its canon and standardizing its theology, Ethiopia was doing something else entirely. It was preserving.
He sees it as a kind of communion with God, and as his contribution to preserving a disappearing tradition.
The Ethiopian biblical tradition was recorded in Ge'ez, a Semitic language closely related to the ancient languages of the Near East. Ge'ez manuscripts are among the most important in the world for scholars of early Judaism and Christianity because they contain complete versions of texts that survive nowhere else in their original form. The Book of Enoch, for example, was known in the West only through brief quotations and fragments until the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought Ge'ez manuscripts back from Ethiopia in 1773. The full text of 1st Enoch exists only in Ge'ez. Think about that. One of the most important Jewish apocalyptic texts in existence, quoted in the New Testament, influential on the theology of the earliest Christians. And we only have it because Ethiopian monks never stopped copying it. The manuscript tradition in Ethiopia is extraordinary. In monasteries perched on cliff faces and nestled into highland valleys, monks copied sacred texts by hand for over a millennium. The Garama Gospels, housed at the Abba Garama Monastery near Adwa,
this is the oldest book in Ethiopia,
and are among the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence, with some scholars dating portions to the 5th or 6th century CE. They contain vivid illuminations of the evangelists and elaborate decorative pages that reveal a sophisticated artistic and theological culture. Picture it: a stone room, walls thick enough to hold back the highland cold, a single oil lamp casting an unsteady golden light, a monk bent over a sheet of parchment made from goat skin, a reed pen in his hand, copying line by line the words of Enoch, the visions of Isaiah, the prophecies of Jubilees. He does not know that in distant Rome, these books are being forgotten. He does not know that in 1,000 years, scholars from another continent will come looking for what he has saved. He only knows that these are sacred words, and that his duty is to preserve them. This is not a story of suppression and conspiracy. It is a story of geography, devotion, and the extraordinary power of a community that decided centuries ago that certain books mattered. And they were right. The cosmic Christ. Now let's return to the figure at the center of all of this. Let's talk about Christ. If you grew up in the Western world, the image of Jesus in your mind was almost certainly shaped by European art. The Renaissance gave us a very specific Christ, human, accessible, emotionally expressive. But think of Michelangelo's Pietà, a grieving mother holding the body of her son. Think of Da Vinci's Last Supper, a group of friends around a table. Think of 1,000 nativity scenes with a baby in a manger and a star overhead. These are beautiful images. They are theologically meaningful, but they represent one tradition's emphasis, the emphasis on Christ's humanity, his gentleness, his approachability. Now, open the book of Revelation, chapter 1. The Apostle John describes a vision of the risen Christ. His hair is white like wool, white as snow. His eyes are like a flame of fire. His feet are like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. His voice is like the roar of many waters. Out of his mouth comes a sharp two-edged sword. His face shines like the sun in full strength. When John sees him, he falls at his feet as though dead. This is not gentle Jesus, meek and mild. This is a figure of overwhelming, terrifying power. And now go back further. Open first Enoch. In the parables of Enoch, the Son of Man is described as a pre-existent figure chosen before the creation of the world. He sits on a throne of glory. Kings and the powerful of the earth fall before him. He judges the wicked and vindicates the righteous. He is hidden with God before the ages and revealed at the end of time. Now open the ascension of Isaiah. Christ descends through 7 heavens. In each heaven, he takes on a form that matches the angels of that level, concealing his true nature. He passes through the firmament where fallen powers hold dominion. He arrives on earth without being recognized. He lives, he dies, he descends to the realm of the dead. And then he rises. He ascends back through every heaven. And this time, every angel sees him for what he is. They worship. They tremble. This is what scholars sometimes call a descent-ascent Christology. And it imagines Christ's mission not just as a journey from Galilee to Golgotha, but as a cosmic journey from the highest heaven to the lowest depths of creation and back again. The incarnation is not merely God becoming a man in a manger. It is God penetrating every layer of reality, entering the territory of hostile spiritual powers, defeating them from within, and ascending in triumph. This is the cosmic Christ. The 7 heavens in the ascension of Isaiah are not meant to be understood as a literal map of outer space. Ancient cosmology expressed spiritual realities through spatial metaphors. When these texts describe Christ passing through heavenly layers, They are making claims about the scope and totality of his redemptive work. Every corner of reality, every level of existence, nothing is untouched. Ethiopian Christian iconography reflects this vision. In Ethiopian depictions of Christ are strikingly different from Western ones. Large, almond-shaped eyes gaze directly at the viewer. Faces are flat, frontal, almost confrontational in their directness. The colors are vivid, deep reds, golds, blues. There is no attempt at Renaissance perspective or naturalism. These are icons in the truest sense, windows into a spiritual reality, not portraits of a historical man. The Ethiopian artistic and theological tradition never underwent the same humanizing, rationalizing shifts that shaped Western Christianity from the Middle Ages onward. It retained a sense of Christ as a figure of cosmic majesty. Not exclusively, Ethiopian theology also emphasizes Christ's humanity and compassion, but the cosmic dimension never faded the way it did in the West. And that, for a growing number of scholars, theologians, and even filmmakers, is what makes this tradition so fascinating right now. Power, canon, and authority. Let's address the question that is probably forming in your mind right now. If these texts are so ancient, so theologically rich, so connected to early Christian thought, why were they excluded from most Christian Bibles? The honest answer is complicated, and anyone who gives you a simple answer is probably selling something. Canon formation in early Christianity was not a top-down decree. It was a messy, centuries-long process driven by a combination of theological reflection, a liturgical practice, regional tradition, and yes, institutional politics. Different communities used different texts. What was authoritative in Alexandria might be unknown in Antioch. What was cherished in Ethiopia might be viewed with suspicion in Rome. Over time, certain criteria emerged for inclusion. Was a text believed to have been written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? Was it consistent with the theological consensus that was developing around the nature of Christ, on the Trinity, and salvation? Was it widely used in worship across multiple regions? Books like 1st Enoch failed several of these tests in the Western context. Its authorship was attributed to a pre-Mosaic patriarch, which made its status ambiguous. Its theology of the Watchers and the fallen angels, while influential, was seen by some church fathers as potentially problematic. And as Greek and Latin became the dominant languages of Western theology, texts preserved primarily in Ge'ez simply fell off the radar. The ascension of Isaiah had a different trajectory.
The power of the Holy Spirit can be with you all wherever you are. Go into the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Peace be with you.
It was known and respected in some early Christian circles, but its vision of 7 heavens and its detailed angelology made it hard to fit neatly into the more streamlined theological frameworks that were developing in the 4th and 5th centuries. It is important to resist 2 temptations here. The first is the temptation to see a grand conspiracy. And there is no credible evidence that a secret cabal of bishops deliberately suppressed these texts to hide the truth. Canon formation was far too diffuse and decentralized for that. Different churches made different decisions for different reasons, and those decisions were often revisited over time. The second temptation is to dismiss these texts as irrelevant. They were not included in the Western canon, but that does not mean they are without value. The Book of Enoch profoundly influenced New Testament theology. The Ascension of Isaiah offers one of the earliest and most detailed Christological narratives outside the Gospels. These are not footnotes to Christian history. They are chapters that were read differently depending on where you stood. What the Ethiopian tradition demonstrates is that canon is not universal. It is contextual. The 81 books of the Ethiopian Bible are not an aberration, and they are a reminder that early Christianity was far more diverse than any single tradition can contain. The boundaries of Scripture were drawn by communities, and different communities drew different lines. This does not mean that every excluded text deserves equal status with the Gospels. It means that the conversation about what belongs in Scripture and why is more nuanced, more historically conditioned, and more fascinating than most people realize. Mel Gibson's Cosmic Christ. In 2004, Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ hit theaters like a thunderclap. Filmed almost entirely in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin, marketed not through traditional Hollywood channels, but through churches, pastors, and faith networks. Unflinching in its depiction of the scourging and crucifixion. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece of devotional cinema. Others, including the Anti-Defamation League, accused it of anti-Semitism. Richard Blake, writing in the Jesuit magazine America, had described Caviezel's Jesus not as a tragic hero, but as, in his words, a punching bag. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops noted that Gibson had perhaps emphasized the how of Christ's death at the expense of the why. None of that mattered at the box office. The film earned over $612 million worldwide on a budget of roughly $30 million. It held the record as the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history for 20 years. Love it or hate it. The Passion proved something that Hollywood had not believed. There was an enormous, underserved, and fiercely loyal audience for serious, visceral, uncompromising biblical cinema. And almost immediately, people began asking about a sequel. Gibson spoke about it for years, teased it, delayed it. In July 2023, he said it was coming soon. He revealed he had two different versions of the screenplay he was working on. One, he said, was structured and strong, more or less what audiences would expect. And the other, in his own words, was like an acid trip. By January 2025, sitting across from Joe Rogan on one of the most watched podcasts in the world,
how do you choose who's going to be the next Jesus?
You use him again.
Caviezel.
Yeah, I know it's 20 years later.
Gibson confirmed the title, The Resurrection of the Christ. And he dropped a detail that should have made every student of early Christian literature sit up straight. In order to really tell the story properly, Gibson said, you have to start with the fall of the angels. Think about that. Not with the empty tomb. Not with Mary Magdalene in the garden at dawn. He wants to begin with the war in heaven, the rebellion of the angels, the origin of cosmic evil. And from there, he described the story as a journey into other realms. Christ descending into hell, confronting fallen powers, battling demons on their own territory. A resurrection that is not a quiet Sunday morning miracle, but an event that tears through the fabric of spiritual reality. This is not a small film. The production budget has been reported at approximately $100 million per installment, and the project has now been split into two parts. Part 1 is set for release on Good Friday, March 26, 2027. Part 2 is planned for 40 days later on Ascension Day, May 6th. The symmetry is deliberate. The calendar itself becomes part of the storytelling. Our principal photography began in October 2025 at Cinecittà Studios in Rome.
Special features, you now learn about the existence of the studio Cinecittà here in Rome.
The same legendary studio complex where Gibson shot the original Passion 2 decades earlier. Additional filming is taking place in the ancient southern Italian towns of Matera, Gravina in Puglia, Genosa, and Krakow, locations chosen for their stark, time-worn landscapes that can convincingly stand in for first-century Judea. The entire original cast has been replaced. Finnish actor Jaakko Otonen, known for The Last Kingdom, now plays Jesus. Cuban actress Mariela Garriga takes over as Mary Magdalene. Kasia Smutniak plays the Virgin Mary. The scripts, co-written by Gibson and Braveheart screenwriter Randall Wallace, are being kept under extraordinary secrecy. At the American film market in late 2025, buyers were not even permitted to read them before committing. Now, Here is where our story and Gibson's story converge. Gibson's described vision, the fall of the angels, the descent through realms, the confrontation with demonic powers, the harrowing of hell, the triumphant ascent, maps almost perfectly onto the ancient apocalyptic literature we have been discussing throughout this video. The war in heaven appears in Enoch. The descent through layered spiritual realms is the architecture of the ascension of Isaiah. The cosmic battle between Christ and the forces of darkness is the theological heartbeat of Ethiopian Christianity's preserved tradition. It is important to be precise here. There is no public evidence that Gibson is directly drawing on 1st Enoch or the ascension of Isaiah. His stated theological influences come from Catholic tradition, patristic writings, and likely the Gospel of Nicodemus, an early Christian text that contains a vivid account of the harrowing of hell. The harrowing itself is mainstream Christian doctrine. It appears in the Apostles' Creed. It was discussed by church fathers from Origen to Augustine. Gibson does not need to have read Enoch to arrive at these images, but the thematic resonance is extraordinary, and it is not coincidental in the way a conspiracy theorist might suggest. It is convergent. Gibson is drawing on the deep roots of Christian theology, and those roots lead to the same soil that produced these ancient apocalyptic texts. He is reaching back, whether he knows it or not, past the Renaissance, past the medieval period, past the councils and the canon debates, to something very old and very powerful, a Christ who does not simply die and rise, but who descends through realms of spiritual darkness, a Christ who confronts fallen powers on their own territory, a Christ whose resurrection is not a quiet miracle, but a cosmic event that reverberates through every level of reality. These are the themes of the ascension of Isaiah. These are the images of 1st Enoch. And these are the theological convictions that Ethiopian monks have been copying onto goatskin parchment for nearly 2 millennia. And now, a Hollywood production with a $200 million combined budget, filming in the same Roman studios where Fellini and Scorsese once worked, is about to bring something remarkably similar to a global audience of hundreds of millions. That is not a coincidence. That is a cultural moment. It suggests that the sanitized, domesticated, the greeting card Christ of popular Western imagination is no longer sufficient for a world that senses something larger behind the story. People are hungry for the cosmic dimension, for the Christ who does not merely save individual souls, but who reclaims the entire cosmos. For the version of the story that the Ethiopian highlands never forgot. The manuscripts still sit in quiet monasteries, untouched for centuries, their pages holding visions of a Christ unlike the one we think we know. Every line, every image, every margin note whispers of a story that stretches from before creation to the final judgment. A story that challenges what we've been taught, what we've believed, what we've seen in museums and paintings. History chose one version. Tradition preserved another. But somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, in a monastery carved from stone, the oldest surviving portrait of Christ waits. Waiting for someone brave enough to see beyond the familiar, beyond the canon, beyond the comfortable. What else has been hidden in the shadows of time? What truths have been waiting silently for centuries to confront everything we thought we knew? The story is far from over, and the next chapter may change everything,